Welcome on behalf of the Literaturforum im Brecht-Haus to Nichtstun fürs Klima, Brecht's Daoism, Useless Trees and the Action of Non-Action. Doing nothing for the climate, that sounds like a contradiction to much of what we have discussed today, and perhaps also to Brecht himself. After all, Brecht wanted to change social conditions, not leave them as they were. He was a planner, a maker of models, someone who intervened. So how does such a thinker end up defending useless trees? And how can we think intervention and stepping back together, planning and limitation, socialism and the deliberate leaving of space? These are the questions that Troy Vettese, Drew Pendergrass and Heinrich Detering will discuss this evening. The discussion will be moderated by Alexander Karshnia, co-founder of & Company, a theatre collective that remixes history as pop collage against the amnesia of the present. He is also, together with Hans Christian von Hermann, curator of the Brecht-Tage 2026. Thank you both for your work. And now I will hand over to Alex. My name is Isabel Wanger, and please join me in welcoming the podium.
Thank you very much, Isabel. I hope all of you know that this is in English, this talk. We have been talking already yesterday on 2 different panels and a discussion round with Troy and Drew. I only shortly introduce you again. Troy Vettese, they both are the authors of this book, Half-Earth Socialism. Troy Vettese is environmental historian, and Drew Pendergrass has an education as environmental engineer. And you joined forces to write this book. We discussed already on 2 different panels with both of you separately your book. And today, you're going to continue your discussion with Heinrich Detering, who I'm glad to introduce to you. Heinrich Detering is Literaturwissenschaftler, literary scholar. You're from the University of Göttingen, but you no more teaching. That's why you had time, you just told me, to write a wonderful book that I only discovered after I already invited you. A little anecdote, I'm from Frankfurt am Main, and there's my favorite bookstore is called Karl Marx Buchhandlung, and of course a Karl Marx Buchhandlung had very prominently placed this book, which is called Die Revolte der Erde, Karl Marx und die Ökologie, so it's about Marx and ecology, and it took me a while to understand that this Heinrich Detering is the same Heinrich Detering who wrote this book. And I invited him because of this book, which is a little bit older, and it's Bertolt Brecht and Lao Tse. And it's about Brecht and Daoism. So this is the reason why this was fitting so well to these 2 gentlemen here is that both of them are writing a new book, a 2nd edition. And I already know one of the chapters, and this chapter is about Brecht and Daoism. So at the beginning of these days, I was promising that we will talk about the possibility that Brecht might be an eco-socialist avant la lettre. I already said there's a lot of contradictory. We talked a lot about aspects of his work where quite the opposite, but there is one text that we will read, at least one text that fits very well to your idea of a half-earth socialism. But before we talk, I want to discuss actually both in a way parallel, because the way you describe Marx and ecology is very interesting in the way you view Brecht, and maybe comparable because we now only focused on text like from the late 40s or the middle 40s. You know, we had Kaukasischer Kreisekreis, the last version of Solidaritätslied, as very explicit text, and Die Erziehung der Hirse from 1950. But if we look at the Taoist influence, and you will talk about how the Taoist influence and the ecological approach fit together, it's a much longer story, which you described very well in your book. But maybe before we go into Daoism, can you please tell us a little bit how you, about this book on Marx, and what is your perspective? You have written a lot of books about different authors, but you discovered quite recently ecology as a background for your writing.
This thing is working? Yeah. Thank you very much for having me, first of all. I'm really honored to be on this podium with these people. It started with a book that I tried to write a couple of years ago about the discovery, and I decided to call it a discovery of ecology, ecological networks, ecological modes of thinking within German literature, scholarly literature in the 18th and 19th centuries. It is one of my theses in that book that the discovery of ecology as we know it since Ernst Haeckel coined that term in the 1860s, has been discovered and developed as a model of looking at our own position within the living world on the very threshold between scientific, scholarly writing on the one hand and poetic imagination on the other. Because in the 18th and still in the early 19th centuries, it was expected from a well-educated scholar in Germany, like in Britain or France, to be able to write poetry about the very same issues and topics. And so my book starts with Albrecht von Haller, one of the inventors of modern science and botanics in the 1730s, has a key figure in, of course, Johann Wolfgang Goethe, and ends with Alexander von Humboldt. And it's called Human Beings in the World Garden, which is a poetic metaphor that Goethe invented, Menschen im Weltgarten, the invention of ecology in poetry. A kind of follow-up, second volume, was a study on the very same topic in the works and the poetic works of the most important female poet in German 19th century poetry, Annette von Droste-Hülshoff. That is a separate volume because the conditions of education for women, even aristocratic women like her, were so different. They were not allowed entrance to the institutions of science, that she writes under totally different conditions and comes to very similar conclusions that I try to analyze and describe by means, among others, of Bruno Latour's actor network theory. And along this way, which took me 2 volumes and 600-700 pages of work, I rediscovered an author that I had forgotten for a long time, that I'd been more familiar with when I was a young man, and that was Karl Marx, as someone who was very close, indeed even topographically and socially close to Annette von Droste-Hülshoff. They had friends, common friends, and published in the same magazines even. And what I discovered was that, I think it was really a discovery, it wasn't that popular, that Karl Marx actually started as a poet, a romantic poet, when he studied in Bonn in his 20s and early 30s. He was still a kind of Jünger, what is it? Disciple actually of German Romanticism and romantic concepts of nature, focusing on the core idea that of romantic Naturwissen, Naturdenken, that we are part of a dynamic system that consists of both human and non-human forms of life that interact all the time and that co-develop through history. His discovery of Charles Darwin's history of evolution, while writing on the Capital, his main, of course, his Hauptwerk, his main work, he himself thinks this is just some kind of rediscovery of a reformulation of things that are being expressed much more neutral and scholarly precisely in Darwin than they used to be expressed in romantic poetry. But it's the same mode of thinking, more specific, more systematic, but it's basically the same idea. And I try to follow the traces of Marx's ecologic thinking from his romantic beginnings up to the very last texts that the concepts and notes that he makes for the second and third volume of the Kapital that were never accomplished, as we know. And being a literary scholar, I'm not into economy or I'm not into environmental sciences, but my field of research is the mode of talking, the kind of Denkfiguren that are formulated within certain kinds of metaphors, certain stylistic and rhetorics, certain modes of writing that reflect certain modes of thinking, of being in the world, and of relating to things. And to give you just one example of what I mean to say here is the Brecht expression of the große Nährerin, the image of the earth as the one who nurtures us and all of her children. That is, at the end of the first chapter of the Kapital, Marx has this famous, it's more than a metaphor, it's a kind of allegory of what all economic activity, human economic activity implies, and that is that two parents interact, which is, as he puts it, father work, Vater Arbeit, and mother earth. He refers to, using that phrase to national economists from Scotland and Britain, but he transforms these traditional modes of writing to this romantic metaphor of some kind of sacred family, holy family. Mother earth, father work, and the child is the economy. That is not just one point in the long history of the Kapital, but it's an ongoing metaphor. It's being transformed in very different ways up to the very last notes that he takes. I've discussed all this with Kohei Saito, who was kind of guiding me to very late Marx and his masses and masses of excerpts from scientific contemporary writings from all fields of science, and who was surprised to learn from me that, in fact, all this late activity after the publication of the Kapital already had started in the 1930s, when he, in the 1830s, when he himself said, I was amongst those who sang the last free forest songs, die letzten freien Waldlieder of German Romanticism. It's remarkable that Marx should have said something like that, but he did, and he had reasons to do that.
For us, this is very valuable. One of the partners we work with is the Netzwerk Naturwissen, so I was very happy when you're using the term, natural knowledge. So, and you said there's a natural knowledge, also a romantic natural knowledge, and that part that Marx was affected by it. I mean, I also didn't know that he was a student of August Wilhelm Schlegel in Bonn, and you also published his poems. It's tempting to read those poems by Marx now, but we put it a bit aside, but keep it in mind that the literary education of Marx, that you very carefully write down the way his writing is literary, but also his education, that Brecht is a good Marx reader and might have also recognized a lot of analogs and had the same education. So this might already be a hint of how ecological thinking is also in Brecht. But for you, Brecht now has a very special role. It doesn't play that role in your first book yet. You have other references like utopian socialism also. You make it very productive. And then you discovered, as I understood you were looking for a Marxist thinker that might be of use for you, using this idea of the half-Earth. Maybe not all of you have heard the explanation of half-Earth. It's actually a concept that was developed by a natural scientist who is his last book, E.O. Wilson, and he suggested that humanity should leave half of the Earth to wildlife in order to combat the loss of biodiversity. And he even made some calculations why it's important that it be half Earth. So this is not your idea. You took that idea from E.O. Wilson, but you added socialism because Wilson wrote that this is not needed. He wrote to all his fans. I mean, he was also a writer. He wrote an Ameisenroman or ant novel, which is actually pretty good. I read it. It's pretty good, but actually he exemplifies in his novel, how you can do that without any interference in property. So you make sure, don't worry, we can do that. And there you came in and said, we don't think so. That's why socialism. Now, you discovered, I think we make this jump to this text of yours that nobody knows yet besides me and Heinrich at Detering, because we already read your draft, and read the Brecht text in original German, if I may, where you say, okay, this might be that Brecht is onto something else. So, I'm reading for you Herr K. und die Natur. Befragt über sein Verhältnis zur Natur, sagte Herr K. Ich würde gern mitunter aus dem Haus tretend ein paar Bäume sehen. Besonders da sie durch ihr der Tages- und Jahreszeit entsprechendes anders aussehen, einen so besonderen Grad von Realität erreichen. Auch verwirrt es uns in den Städten mit der Zeit, immer nur Gebrauchsgegenstände zu sehen, Häuser und Bahnen, die unbewohnt leer, unbenutzt sinnlos wären. Unsere eigentümliche Gesellschaftsordnung, sehr schön, ne? Eigentümliche Gesellschaftsordnung, lässt uns ja auch die Menschen zu solchen Gebrauchsgegenständen zählen. Und da haben Bäume, wenigstens für mich, der ich kein Schreiner bin, etwas beruhigend Selbstständiges, von mir Absehendes. Und ich hoffe sogar, sie haben selbst für die Schreiner einiges an sich, was nicht verwertet werden kann. Das ist eigentlich schon die Hauptsache, ich lese trotzdem zu Ende. Warum fahren Sie, wenn Sie Bäume sehen wollen, nicht einfach manchmal ins Freie, fragte man ihn. Herr Keuner antwortet erstaunt, ich habe gesagt, ich möchte Sie sehen, aus dem Haus tretend. Herr K. sagte auch, es ist nötig für uns, von der Natur einen sparsamen Gebrauch zu machen. Ohne Arbeit in der Natur weilend gerät man leicht in einen krankhaften Zustand. Etwas wie Fieber befällt einen. Das ist auch noch interessant. Okay, you coined a nice phrase we heard about, it's all about use value. You said maybe there's also, we're lacking a new value, maybe a useless value.
Hello, okay. I'm glad you read it till the end, because I think that last part's also important. I think this idea of like being in the forest and having this fever, this like strange feeling come over you, I think that's as important as being in the city and seeing useless trees. And I wonder a bit about this feeling, and maybe we can talk about Daoism and Wu Wei. Like what is, like, when one is in nature and one cultivates a certain kind of attention when one is in nature, it does feel a bit like a strange fever. I mean, I'm a big bird watcher, and I think that is when I kind of engage in that kind of strange, diffused attention when one is in nature. And just to your point before about older scientists writing poetry in the 18th and early 19th century, I heard that some astronomers, they started this fashion where they would write a haiku instead of an abstract for their papers, and then people have kept on doing this. So it still exists a little bit. I suppose like the bit about Herkoina, I first encountered that in the concept of nature in Marx, which is by Schmidt. What's his first name? Alfred Schmidt. And it's near the end of the book, and he's like, well, maybe this is like one moment in socialist thought that is quite ecological in some ways. And then I returned to it years later because we wrote this book on half of socialism, and I was talking to a friend, and he was saying, you know, you propose veganism and rewilding and energy quotas, but other people would say you want nuclear or geoengineering, and we're all just like pulling levers on the Earth system. You have your levers, they have their levers. We all see the Earth as this machine that we're trying to operate. And we're stuck in that debate. And I felt that that somehow veganism and rewilding were different ways of interacting with nature, but I couldn't really express how, right? And then we're also like looking for a lineage in a way of Marxists who care about animals and nature more broadly, because I think a lot of eco-socialists, they came quite late to the climate question, but they still haven't really engaged with biodiversity or animal rights and plenty of other issues. It's just like, how can we solve this irrational problem caused by irrational capitalism, which is climate change, and we'll just manage this carbon cycle better. And I think that's kind of missing the point in some ways. So we draw a lot on utopian socialists who, 200 years ago, a lot of them were romantic poets and these other figures, and a lot of them were vegetarian. And they kept writing these utopias where everyone is vegetarian, but they wanted to still turn the world into a garden. And they also seem to have an animus against apex predators. A lot of these utopias would get rid of all the wolves, for instance. And I was almost at a loss, like even these like really nice romantic, poets and, these vegetarian socialists, even they couldn't really accept nature as it is in a way. They couldn't imagine a socialism or like a future society where we could actually cooperate or coexist with nature. And I suppose I was getting a bit sad thinking about this. Like no one is able to really imagine like why we would need wilderness in socialism. And then I thought about this Koiner story again. And I think this idea that ultimately we should care about nature not because it's a good lever for us to draw down carbon and whatnot, but also because we care for it, right? And I think there's like some useless things are also important, be it like love or, beauty or the natural world, right? Maybe some species in some rainforests, you can say, who cares about that? But then it still matters, even if its disappearance doesn't affect. It doesn't have like some kind of special medicine in its DNA or something like this. So we wanted to kind of articulate that. And I think in Marxism, they just approach things through problems of rationality and use and action. And you can't think certain thoughts within, we're both Marxists, but you can't think certain thoughts within Marxism. That's why people haven't turned to this need for wilderness. And then the fact that Brecht was able to turn to Daoism and then he was able to have that thought was extremely eye-opening for us. So that's kind of how we got to it.
Yeah, I'll just add a little bit of, Troy and I are writing another book, which is a distinct book, but continuing similar ideas. And one of the other themes that we were trying to work out is in sort of more recent utopias of how can we actually abolish capitalism, what might be the system that takes its place. There's sort of a remarkable continued interest in like ideas of optimality or ideas of efficiency or something like this. And this is sort of an old Marxist point of, capitalism is actually irrational and gets in its own way. And if you got rid of all this irrationality, you would unleash, the fetters of production, make, a fully automated utopia or something like this. And so there's often in these proposals of a socialism, there's these models of market socialism, there's models of like planned socialism that are coming out over the last 100 years. They always want to prove that this is some optimal thing. And one of the themes that we were trying to get at in the new book is this idea that somehow the hard part of getting rid of capitalism isn't the calculation question. Because I think people get hung up on this idea that markets calculate how to distribute things, and we need to come up with our own calculation that would be better than markets or something like this, and we can use computers and all these things. And what we became convinced by through some very long histories that you can read about in the new book that I won't recount here, but people actually trying to do this in Hungary in the 60s and things like this, people actually trying to use computers to plan an economy. What these people encountered, and I think these new utopians would encounter, is that you can actually make a pretty good plan even with a computer in the 60s, and then you give out all your optimal prices to the state-owned enterprises or to your Yugoslavian worker cooperatives, and then all of a sudden people just ignore the prices, because what actually was going on is a complicated system of negotiations, and prices just had this role that was not what was imagined, because optimizing in the center doesn't lead to action automatically. In some ways, the problem is not calculating. The problem is how to organize the world in some way. And so this leads to this very interesting critique that emerges out of Hungary and Hungarian thought, which is that actually there's only two ways to organize a modern economy. You can either do capitalism and your plan is enforced by bankruptcy. So, prices are calculated, everyone has to follow the price, and if you don't, you go bankrupt or you go hungry or something. You have to obey money in some ways. Or you can do Stalinism, which is that you calculate some optimal system and then you enforce it, at the butt of a gun. And it doesn't really matter if you start the system like being really earnest. You'll end up either going to some sort of capitalist system or some sort of Stalinist system. And Troy and I didn't like this. We don't think this is true. But actually, we started to feel that this sort of idea of this idea that the world is something to be controlled was very similar. It resonated with this idea that the environment is something to be controlled. That was coming up in a lot of this Marxist literature of pulling these levers. And this is sort of where we got this kind of weird idea that maybe there's some sort of need to let go and embrace uselessness and embrace inefficiency, both in terms of nature and also in terms of society. So this is where, maybe we'll talk about this a little more about this element of democracy. But to us, the way you break out of this binary is letting go of the idea that you can control everything. And we have some ideas about how you might do this. But this idea that optimality is not the right way of going about things. This is also an idea that I think resonates with this nature idea. So there's sort of like this universal theory of letting go that we've sort of started to come to as we've been doing this weird project.
I was really charmed by reading your quotation of that Koina parable in your chapter that I had the privilege to read before the book is actually published. It reminded me of something that I read in Bertolt Brecht's diaries from his very young Brecht's diaries from his pre-Marxist era. In 1921, I guess, here in Berlin, he went to hear a presentation by Alfons Goldstein, one of the early German communists, who had returned from the Soviet Union and gave a presentation about the advancements in Soviet Russia. And Brecht writes in his diary, I am frightened by what I hear, not because things are so chaotic over there, but on the contrary, because they are so well organized. I flee from that kind of organization. And then he says, my friend Frank, a Jewish friend of his at that time, he gave me his copy of Lao Tzu, the Tao Te Ching, and I was surprised, I was stunned to find how much, and this is lovely formulated, how much Lao Tzu agrees with me.
Typical Brecht.
That everything is just in one flow, and there is nothing like organization. You can't even organize the world. You will just destroy the world around you and yourself by trying to control it. I find that remarkable, and of course, and I think that much of this this early idea of Brecht's first encounter with Daoism continues throughout his writing until his very last year. Actually, I think in 1956, immediately before his death, he recurs to that tree thing in a poem where he writes, okay, I just wanted to find it here, a poem that he had written as a young man and now reworks immediately before his death. It's called My Address to a Tree Named Mr. Green. He had written that as a young man, and now he adds 2 lines that say, und ich weiß jetzt, it's addressed to the tree in his garden, und ich weiß jetzt, einzig durch ihre unerbittliche Nachgiebigkeit stehen sie heute Morgen noch gerade. Only because you always gave in, you never refused anything, you just let go, and that is why you're still alive and standing upright in my garden.
Aber das unerbittlich.
And you never, you always refused to refuse. That's of course Brechtian dialectics, yeah. And I think it's the same idea, and it shows how much of his work is actually covered by this kind of undercurrent of an undercurrent can't cover anything, but yeah, you know, how omnipresent this undercurrent of Taoist opposition against some of his very own ideas of Stalinist control. Is present in his and remains present in his writings.
Just really quickly on the topic of trees. There's that poem like To the Unborn, or Who's Not Born Yet, or whatever it is in Genau. And what I like about it is that there's that one line where like a conversation about trees is a crime, right? Would be a crime. And he's someone who like loves talking about trees, right? And the whole point of the poem is like living in these dark times, it is also like deforming our own like humanity. So he has to give up what he also wants to talk about, right?
Generally, that would be worth a book of its own, Brecht and the trees. Or the trees and their Brecht, maybe. When he says in the Svenborg poems, I would prefer to go to my desk to write a poem about the blooming apple tree, but instead I feel myself forced to write a poem against Hitler. I regret to have to do so, yeah.
So you wonderfully already came to the Taoist, which is such an important concept for you. Just wanted to mention, as you discovered that ecological thinking is at the beginning of Marx and not coming at a certain point, like Kohei Saito and other people since the year 2000, you know all these eco-Marxists. It's also interesting that it's such a theme of the 21st century, and Alfred Schmidt is a rare exception, and it's also questionable. Some of it. You made
it's a remarkable book, though, I must
is.
say. It's the first book about Marx and nature, really, and it has to be cherished for that.
But as soon as you read it, you wonder why so late, you know. But you show it very. You show how it's from the beginning. You also show how Taoist thinking. You mentioned it. 1920. Brecht is already interested. And it follows all through the work, because a lot of people think only of this one big poem, you know, die Legende von der Entstehung des Buch Tao Te Ching auf dem Weg in die Emigration des Lao Tse. And he said, no, that's we shouldn't read all the Taoist quotes only through this poem, and you show how they keep returning. And often it is the water, you know, the soft water. This is, of course, a metaphor he uses a lot, and is connected to the concept of Wu Wei. You know? And this is what we try to say. We play around it when we say Nichtstun fürs Klima. Of course, it's a provocation, because it's very hard to translate what is Wu Wei. You know, it is an effortless action or an action without desire. It has been translated. It's an acting, non-acting. Of course, it's also interesting for acting on the stage. You know, that's the whole chapter. But for you, this was the important link to think of something that would be an alternative to the Stalinist solution, or let's call it, we know also see an eco-Leninism, you know? People think it's so urgent, we gotta do something, and it's happening, you know, and you say, maybe we should not do so much, but we should do differently, or do less.
I mean, in the parable of Herr Koiner that you quote, the most interesting phrase for me is that Koiner says, I like to step out of my house and see the trees on the streets who do not care about me. They are not interested in me. These are the only living beings that don't want anything from me, and so I don't want anything from them either. This is the very opposite of what you describe as this kind of Kosten-Nutzen, use and exploitation thinking. That's lovely, and it's astonishing for a man who, at the same time, and we spoke about that before in the afternoon, at least with part of his energy, supports Stalin's great plan for reshaping nature in the Soviet Union, with all the terrible nature engineering and all the mishaps that happened.
I want to also just turn the table and ask you some questions in a way, because you're Brecht's experts here. And I wonder, when you read Brecht's poems, there is this kind of, Drew and I were talking about this, it's kind of like gentle violence sometimes. I mean, like there's a poem about like the drowned girl, or the ballad of Cortez's men, and it's like kind of like awful things are happening to people, but nature doesn't mean any ill will, right? It's just acting in this way, and I wonder. So the trees in the city are kind of, they're harmless in a way, but also is a reminder that we are not at the center of things. And I think that's an important thing to remember, because I think with a lot of eco-socialist work, it's always saying, this human-nature relationship, and it's like, there's also like a nature-nature relationship. Like, we're not always so important, right? And I think he recognized that.
Just like, wonderfully said. Just like the other beings within nature as well, like the stones in the river and the water of the river and the fish in the water, they're not that much interested in each other. They're interested in, swimming or just lying there or streaming, but they let each other be as long as they have the right to exist themselves. Like young Brecht writes in the Hauspostille, I think this is Daoism avant la lettre in Brecht's writing, and it's very typical. I think you can find hundreds of quotations like this about swimming in rivers and lakes, vom Schwimmen in Flüssen und Seen. Natürlich muss man auf dem Rücken liegen, so wie gewöhnlich, und sich treiben lassen. Man muss nicht schwimmen, nein, nur so tun, als gehöre man einfach zu Schottermassen. So we're not just, he advises us not to swim like fish in the water, but he advises us to be like stones in the water, who slowly drift along with the stream and enjoy that. The stones that's true, in the river. Man muss nichts tun, sich treiben lassen. And this is a way, actually, in this poem, of enjoying yourself, of having a better time for yourself than by just having to act and transform and do something with the stones or with the river, build anything.
Yeah, I think Brecht, like Marx, has tensions in him. Like, I think you were talking about the
he's a
Brecht
living
supporting
tension,
these things. One of the ways that Troy and I have thought about this is that in Marxism, one of the core ideas is use value versus exchange value. So like an object has some sort of use value. It's useful in some ways, but it also can be exchanged. And in capitalism, sort of the exchange comes first, just putting things very roughly. Like you produce something to make a profit, and it has to be useful for you to make a profit, but that's not really the point of things. And one of the critiques of Marxism is like, well, what if we flip that around? Maybe we produce for use and produce for need instead of mediating things in this way. And so Marxism in some ways has developed these really useful categories to help understand capitalism, and it sort of flips them to imagine what the opposite is. And while this can give you very strong critiques, it can give you pretty weak utopias in some ways, is how we've thought about it. Like if you flip and only produce for use value, you can end up with Brecht in so far as he's embodying this sort of more orthodox Marxist view. He can push for crazy agricultural ideas or something like this, or push for very, very productivist, violent sort of kinds of production. Because the utopia is sort of an inverted world in some way of capitalism's inverted world. And that doesn't necessarily solve the problem. And to the extent that Brecht is able to have these tensions, it's, in our feeling, it's because he's drawing from other traditions like Daoism and, also the theater and his experience and all these different things. And so to some degree, this explains the tensions in him. And so this sort of motivates us as in like, to us, eco-socialism or thinking about a utopia, you can use your Marxism for the critiques and for a lot of things, but you can't just rely on it alone. Otherwise, you flip and you kind of stay in this world of tight optimality or something like this, but you're optimizing something else in some ways. Not that this is necessarily a part of Marxism, but it's a tendency that's very common. Yeah, I don't know if you want to add.
Well, I guess it's like, what's the point of Marxism and socialism in general? It's like, well, could we destroy this society that's predicated on value, right? And then it seems like a lot of Marxists, they want to then find some kind of substitute system to do that calculation, to figure out like, okay, my labor's worth this, your labor's worth that. And so they destroy that market mechanism and then they want to reinvent it. And again, as you're saying with, Brecht looking at the Soviet Union in the 20s, it's like, that's the whole point of socialism, is to give us a choice to like relax or do something else, right? Rather than to have to force that mechanism that we're trying to get rid of. And it reminds me a little bit, reading. I haven't read as much Lao Tzu as Chuang Tzu, and in Chuang Tzu, the parable of the useless tree is in that collection, and. There's one point where Chuang Tzu is talking to someone else, and this other person is just anxious about this useless tree. Like, what are we going to do about this useless tree, right? And I think that's what a lot of, when we wrote this book about, letting go half the earth, a lot of people are like, you can't do that. I mean, we have to use it. We have to do something with it. And that's like the reaction I think a lot of socialists have. And I think with Daoism, it gives you that way of thinking like, oh, actually, that's okay. It's okay to let go. And I think, again, because every worldview lets you think certain things, and like you have to go outside of it. I mean, the Frankfurt School, they went to Weber to have that critique of instrumentality, and Brecht went to Daoism, but like Marxism can't do it within itself, right? And yeah.
But I think there's three. One could say there's three steps in the development of this genuinely ecological transformation of Marxist thinking, and that is the first is Marx himself. The second is Brecht, who, as you say, has the advantage of including Daoism that Marx didn't know anything about. Lao Tzu was about to be discovered in Europe at the time only, and Marx never knew about him. And the third is what you do and your companions and comrades do right now. Already in Marx, you find the first idea that I find extremely remarkable, though not sufficient in itself, and that is the idea of regarding non-human living beings as actors, to pick up Bruno Latour's term, as actors in their own rights. He does that already in 1844, when he publishes his, I think, very first Marxist articles. Young Karl Marx in the Kölnische Zeitung about recent laws against theft of wood. The poor people shall not be allowed to even gather dead wood from the forest for their own use. Even that is to be forbidden. And he writes wonderfully polemic, satirical articles against this new idea by the aristocrats. And in that article, he says, almost in this formulation, the true owners of the woods and the trees are neither the poor people nor the aristocrats, but the woods and the trees. And among his very latest notes for the never accomplished third volume of the Kapital, he writes what I put on my book here, a little known, a wonderful passage that I want to read. It's vom Standpunkt einer höheren ökonomischen Gesellschaftsformation, so looking back from communism one time in the near future. Vom Standpunkt einer höheren ökonomischen Gesellschaftsformation wird das Privateigentum einzelner Individuen am Erdball so abgeschmackt erscheinen wie das Privateigentum eines Menschen an einem anderen Menschen. Selbst alle Gesellschaften zusammengenommen sind nicht Eigentümer der Erde. Sie sind nur ihre Besitzer und haben sie den nachfolgenden Generationen verbessert zu hinterlassen. Sounds like Fridays for Future, but it's originally Marx in the 1870s. So that's the first step, accepting that non-human forms of life have a right to be there in their own right, not just because they're useful for us. The second step is probably what Brecht incorporates with his Daoist ideas, the idea of not interfering, of letting go, of holding back, not making use of what you could make use of. This would be alien to Marx, I think. I know no place where Marx would say something like, so just let the animals be, let the woods untouched. We have to make use of them, but good use, rational and careful use of it, all that. That isn't it's a progress already, but it's not what we think about. And the third idea is your idea of half Earth, letting nature rule itself in at least part of a non-human world.
Yeah, I think maybe one of the other things that Troy and I have tried to do is sort of be precise about what we mean about these different forms of non-acting interventions, to use a paradox. So to us, we in this book, what we try and do is take some ideas and then criticize them and then try and transform them into what we think is more useful and to use the phrase. But the half-Earth idea, the conservation movement and the environmental movement has a very difficult history. Conservation has involved, expelling people from land to make it, these natural places, and it has this history of, violence. And to us, that's why you add the socialism to it. And to us, you also don't necessarily need to imagine a national park in the traditional sense. We have these ideas of, it's not our ideas, but ideas of land back to indigenous peoples. This is very important in the Americas, where Troy and I are from. These ideas of this. So it's a letting go, but it's not necessarily an imposing a certain vision on this land, but it is withdrawing domination from the land, if that's the way to think about it. So the dominant force of this place is no longer a certain kind of usefulness. It's nature for itself. And this is something that we've also talked about in the chapter that we shared with you guys, is there's ways of thinking about very practical debates in environmental circles that are ways of thinking about letting go. So for example, there's these questions over, should we rapidly cool the Earth intentionally because we're overshooting our climate targets? And there's this idea that you could fly planes to the stratosphere, spray particles to make a permanent volcanic artificial eruption, partially blot out the sun, and it'll cool the Earth. This is quite a serious proposal called stratospheric geoengineering.
Elon Musk.
Yeah. They love this stuff. I mean, Elon might not, but Bill Gates does. But this proposal would be very cheap. It'd be like $1 billion a year. Not bad. Of course, it has pretty dramatic consequences that can't really be known. So that's why we critique it. But to us, for every one of these like grand doing something ideas that kind of emerges in these environmental debates, there's sort of a letting go alternative, or maybe this element. So you could imagine Brecht being into geoengineering, and you could imagine Brecht being into this other proposal that we're thinking, which is there's another way you can rapidly cool the Earth, which is that there's a greenhouse gas, methane. There's many different greenhouse gases. Methane is a really interesting example because it's very powerful, but it only lasts 10 years in the atmosphere. So if you don't constantly replenish the methane, the warming from methane goes away. And the warming that methane contributes is very similar to the amount of cooling that these geoengineers want to do. So there's a let's take this dramatic action, or there's a let's cut these emissions. So this is very practical. I think these ideas, it's not just us enjoying Brecht's poetry, although that's also useful in itself. I just need to stop saying useful. It's enjoyable and pleasurable in itself, but it's also I think it's actually worth our time in terms of our hats as environmentalists to think about things like this. Because I think this general criteria of, are you taking grand action because you feel anxious, or are you letting other logic operate, is to me just a voice in my head that's very helpful in navigating environmental debates.
Yeah, can I say something real quick? I mean, Brecht's poetry is useless. We have to establish that, and that's a good thing.
Yes.
Yeah. But the other thing would be, I think, to go at a different level from the practicality side of or a concrete side of what is Daoist socialism would be. I think the more fundamental question is why do you want to be a master still, right? What pushes that drive? And I think a bit about John Stuart Mill talking to the Chartists in Britain in the 1840s, because they were just fighting for the right for men to vote. And then he said, you don't really care about liberty. You care about, you want to become lords yourselves, right? So I think, similarly, some socialists, they want to become masters of the earth themselves. But why do you want that? And and at some level, it's just a bad way to relate to other people and to the world. I mean, we're just a bunch of, we're like a puny little mammal. We like being outside. We have one short life. What kind of society can we have where we can have the most meaningful experiences during that life is the ultimate question. I mean, Brecht is always talking about reminding you there's this river of time and you will die, basically, and that's the ultimate. Jameson talks about this, and that's that's more important than this timelessness and activity of capitalism, is to return to this older sense of time.
But when dying, you will return to this eternal cycle of natural processes, and this is not some kind of redemption, but it's kind of soothing for Brecht to know that. I think this is also an ongoing theme. I liked your phrase what was it? Non-active interference. This is the literal translation of the Taoist formula of Wu Wei that you use a lot in your chapter. Wu Wei means not only not acting, but acting by not acting, acting by letting go. For instance, cutting down emissions instead of adding different emissions up to the already existing emissions. I think we should not underestimate that in both in classic Daoism and in Brecht, the interest in surviving, in your own survival is great and vivid. And it's totally okay to want to survive, but preferably together with others who want to survive too, other beings. Like, I'd like to quote one other very short poem from this Daoist kind of line where he almost explicitly attacks Stalin in 1953. Eisen, iron, it's not steel, but iron. Eisen. Im Traum heute Nacht sah ich einen großen Sturm. Ins Baugerüst griff er, den Bauschragen riss er, den eisernen abwärts. Doch was aus Holz war, bog sich und blieb. Was da aus Holz war, bog sich und blieb. It's the Iron Man, you know, the steel man on the one hand who breaks and falls apart, and on the other hand, like the tree, the wooden being just gives in and adapts and survives, like the tree in the garden.
I wanted to add a little bit because you were talking about dying, and when we were talking about yesterday, we had a panel on models, and we talked about the model of the Lehrstücke, the learning place. And actually, it's interesting what a recurrent motive it is to learn how to die. And actually, we tried it out with the N Company. We had this piece we did on the floating university, because we're not allowed to use Brecht, you know, but sometimes we change it a little bit. So what worked really well was learning to wir können nicht sterben, to change it, wir können nicht schrumpfen. Because the schrumpfen is shrinking, you know, degrowth. But it's something, this learning to be, and Brecht is also, often you have this motive of becoming small, really shrinking in a literal sense. This is one text, in different moments he has this text that I survived the storm. You know, often we have the storm from Agony, or you know, you often have the superstorm, and I survived it in the smallest Größe, so in the smallest number. And this is probably very much also related to this Daoism. But of course, he also adapts it. I mean, it's not about religion, right? You also it is a certain way of thinking, also playing with language that comes, of course, from his sensibility as a writer, as a poet. You know, that because we are often lacking, like we have a binary code in language. You have active and passive. When we're looking for immediate, for a third, an in between. And I think in your book, maybe you can talk, because we're already now at the Wuvai. I think also when we talked about it, I thought in German maybe eingreifen, I wrote eingreifendes Nichthandeln would be maybe a good Brechtian, because you said you want to describe a Brechtian climate program, you know, the Brechtian eco-socialism. I think this is kind of an interesting way to think beyond, or to use it. And you had a very interesting chapter in your book where you called Lenin, Lao Tse versus Lenin. Right. So maybe you can say something about this very.
I'm just looking for a quotation here from a sinologist that I don't find here at the moment, who explains this idea of Wu-Wei as some kind of paradoxical action, like adapting to the natural forces that are there, sailing with the wind, cutting with the wood, you know, along the lines that the wood already recommends you to cut along, to adapt to structures that you find, and you are well advised to rather adapt to those structures and move within them instead of being disruptive. That is the...
It's often seen as cowardice, no? That's that. This is a weird.
He defends cowardice. He has this famous parable also in the Koiner stories that he repeats in the first version of the Galileo drama, where Galileo is the one who tells the story about, as Galileo puts it in the drama, a famous Greek philosopher named Koinos, which is the story of Herr Koiner, who says there once was a man who had to do slaves work for the rich and wealthy and powerful man. And he did everything that was required from him day in, day out, even at night. He did everything that this fat, rich man required from him. And one day, the rich man said, "Will you serve me?" And the servant doesn't answer, but he keeps on serving until finally the fat man dies because of his being too rich, being too fat, being too unhealthy. The servant, by serving the fat man, helps him to die earlier than he had to die. And when he has washed the corpse, he says no. It has taken some time, but it was his way of saying no, to serve in a way that kind of improved everything that was already on its way, leading to the rich man's death by his own way of living. That's a kind of defense of cowardice as a means of not only surviving, but to be efficient in destroying the destructive powers, helping them shatter by means of their own force. It's like a judo fight.
Maybe before we open it to the audience, I thought it was also interesting how you showed how, of course, Brecht is not a orthodox Taoist, but how it's appropriate.
Such thing as orthodox Taoism.
But you showed a very close reading of the famous poem, also because there are self-contradictions. It is self-contradictory to write down your wisdom anyway, to leave a name, but it's all about that Lao Tse in this poem leaves his wisdom in writing, and then it's also said that his name is... So these contradictions that you wrote a little bit about it is also maybe the way how Brecht tries to use Taoism, but within his Marxism.
Yeah, this is a wonderful poem. I think this is one of the most beautiful and smartest poems, actually, that I know in 20th century German literature in general. Really, I think it ranks that high, Die Entstehung des Buches Dao De Jing. And it's what I analyzed is the meters of the poem, because the meters are obviously inconsistent and unstable and imitate the movements of flowing water, even before the flowing water is mentioned as a motive within the poem. And all meters are different, all lines are different within this long poem, except one line that perfectly follows the rule, and that is the one line that says, "Mit der Zeit den mächtigen Stein besiegt. Du verstehst, das Harte unterliegt." This is the one moment, the second in which the water really flows free in the poem, is when the power of powerless water is mentioned. And this is what the whole mode of writing, the whole art of metrics is focused on. And if you see how Brecht worked and reworked this poem in different versions, you can see how we try to add some classic Marxist ideas, like the Töllner, what is it? The man at the toll booth?
Yeah, the border.
The border warden, or what? Yeah. He's in the first version, he's a rich man, like he actually was in historic China. And then Brecht reworks the whole poem and makes him a poor proletarian guy, so that Lao Tzu stops and gives in to his wish to write down his wisdom because of solidarity with the poor man. This is a stanza that Brecht adds in the very last phase of his writing, because he feels like the whole thing was too Taoist, too passive, and now he has at least some kind of a class struggle concept within this Taoist water parable. And I think actually it was a good idea to do that, because this correction reminds us of the fact that his Lao Tzu's and Brecht's Taoist wisdom might actually help to lead better class struggles, to be smarter in your class struggles than just confronting force with force and maybe lay down bleeding.
Before we go to Q&A, I guess I want to go back a little bit to what you were saying about eco-Leninism earlier. And I wonder if it makes any sense, because from a Brechtian point of view, but we are also drawing a lot on C.L.R. James's work on direct democracy. And for us, direct democracy is like another way of letting go, right? And I think with a lot of these eco-Leninists, they want to keep control, within the party, right? And that to me seems to be another big mistake. And I wonder to what degree one can connect this idea of letting go to Brecht's work with these Lehrstücke and all that. I mean, like another way of having the play not just being didactic, but including people, so they actually could imagine different ways of being, just the way that these climate assemblies are a tool to that end. So I wonder if that makes, that was kind of our we were running with that, but I wonder what you two thought.
Oh yeah, I think there's a big potential. I mean, often these learning plays have to be neglected, or and for many people, including myself, I think this is the most valuable core of Brecht's work and the most radical. And it's also interesting that Brecht, in German it's not Lehrstücke, it sounds already very didactic and authoritarian, but he himself liked the English much better. He said, learning plays are much better, so it's not so much about teaching, lehren, but about learning, lernen. And what I like also in your book, you also write about, okay, we also have to learn the non-learning, we have to learn the non-learning, you write as a Daoist idea. And then now we have a lot of this unlearning, a lot of discourse. We should unlearn this, we have to unlearn. And I think in Brecht it's already there. You have a learning, but you also have this idea of unlearning. And it's a radical idea, that he says audience is only accepted if they're usable. Of course, is they usable, So it is learning. The people learn to perform. It's not for the audience, but for some reasons, audience is useful for those because you want to show what you do. But this is not the main thing. The main thing is that people do it together.
I prefer to say Brecht's poetry is most helpful where it is least useful. Yeah, you can't make use of it. You have no didactic implication or Merksatz that you can keep in mind, but you enter a process that is going on inside you, even after Brecht has long gone. And that is what this kind of poetry is about.
And just in terms of this unlearning, I think Chung Tzu also talks about Wu Wei as like a fasting of the mind, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like how to turn that off in some ways and just experience, right? That's also something, it sounds obvious, but it takes a while to get the hang of it, and then you become kind of addicted to it, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, looking at your watch, I think we should give you a chance also to react. I mean, I was very happy that you also reminded us that this great poem was in the same time that you wrote Galilei, because we were talking about Galilei and the planetarium, Sebastian was, and that you see this connection between Koinos, and the early version of Galileo. And I'm just saying all this to give Sebastian the microphone.
Thank you so much. Very interesting talk. Is it perhaps possible for me to talk in German and you translate a bit? Ich bin so ein bisschen durch, ja, und ich will versuchen, zwei Gedanken, die mir jetzt die ganze Zeit im Kopf rumgehen, zu formulieren. Okay. Das eine ist, ich fand es wirklich ganz toll, wie jetzt diese verschiedenen Motive aufgetaucht sind, das Letting Go, das, was ihr jetzt daoistisch genannt habt. Ich würde noch gerne hinzufügen, es war schon ein bisschen im Raum, dass dieser, glaube ich, für Brecht sehr zentrale und gleichzeitig sehr komplizierte Begriff des Einverständnisses da zu erwähnen ist. Being in agreement, ja. Very complicated, und das ist ja zentral in den Lehrstücken. Ja, it's central for the learning place. Ja. And Einverständnis has to do with being, agreeing to dying, ja, mit der eigenen Sterblichkeit und mit der eigenen Endlichkeit, und auch agreeing with that which you can't change. Ja, which you can't change with the human force. Ja. Damit muss man einverstanden sein, was sich nicht ändern lässt, und mit der eigenen Sterblichkeit. Der Witz in den Lehrstücken, und ich sage es deswegen, weil ihr das ja auch in Mars on Earth nochmal zitiert habt, ist, dass das Einverständnis mit der eigenen Sterblichkeit nicht einfach zum Tod führt, sondern es bringt ein Übermaß hervor. In dem Moment, in the moment where you capture your own finitude, their mortality, there comes to place a kind of potentiality. You have this, you quoted this long passage in Mars on Earth also, der von uns stirbt. Okay. Ja, wie heißt das? Was gibt der auf? Der gibt mehr auf, als er hat. Ja. 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 Und dieses Mehr, das quasi zum Vorschein kommt im Moment des Einverstandenseins mit der Sterblichkeit, dieses Mehr, das ist dasjenige, was gleichzeitig jeden Plan auch durchschlägt, weil es niemals zu fassen ist. Ja. Es gibt auch diese Definition des Menschen von Walter Benjamin, zitiert das Brecht-Wort, der Mensch als das Wesen, das viele Möglichkeiten in sich birgt und verbirgt und deswegen nie ganz zu erkennen ist. Ja. Und daher kommt gewissermaßen das Moment, dass in einem Einverständnis die großen Pläne durchschlägt, ja, weil kein großer Plan in der Lage ist, dieses Potenzial zu fassen. Man findet das ausbuchstabiert in dem frühen Stück Mann ist Mann. Die Ummontierbarkeit von Gaily Gay. Ja. Gaily Gay ist ein Mann, heißt es, der nicht Nein sagen kann. Ja. Deswegen ist er so leicht ummontierbar, aber gerade deswegen, weil er so leicht ummontierbar ist, weil er Ja sagt, sagt er zum nächsten auch wieder Ja. Durchschlägt gewissermaßen immer wieder das, was aus ihm gemacht wird. Ja. Das ist auch diese unerbittliche Nachgiebigkeit. So, diese Ebene finde ich ganz wichtig. Und mein zweiter Gedanke, der mir jetzt durch den Kopf geht, und da komme ich nochmal auf heutige Diskussionen. Und ich fand so wichtig, Heinrich Detering said there's this tension. Brecht is just a tension, and you said there's the Marxist and the Daoist now. Today, people like Chakrabarti, when talking about climate crisis, there is this differentiation between the global and the planetary. And the global sphere or scale is that scale which is anthropocentric, which has to do with social processes, with all this kind of stuff. And then the planetary concerns the biological processes, all that we are involved in, but we can't, it's the non-anthropocentric sphere now. And it's not dualistic, it's always one in another. Yeah? And I think it's important, we could perhaps say the sphere, the scale of the planetary is also the scale where we can only be Taoist in a way, because we can't save the climate in sense of the great gesture and the activism, which means we want to save it by the big program. And on the other hand, we are still in this anthropocenic sphere. And I think this is the sphere where we can be activist in this Marxist way, where we can also question the Eigentum. And if we have, for example, the slogan, dass die Erde schnell die eure werde, die wirklich verheerend ist, wie ich finde. Ich glaube, die vermischt die beiden Skalen. Ja, das ist gewissermaßen die Dialektik darin von heute aus. Da ist das Globale und das Planetare vermischt in einer unguten Weise. Also die Ebene ist übersprungen. Ja. Deswegen kann man mit diesem Slogan heute nichts mehr anfangen. Aber quasi zu verstehen, dass wir in diesen planetaren Prozessen nur nicht handeln können, ja, was auch eine narzisstische Kränkung ist, weil es erstmal den Aktivismus killt. Das ist das, was ich jetzt da rausnehme, dass man quasi diese Tension von Marxist and Daoist vielleicht übertragen kann auf das, was heute diskutiert wird mit Global and Planetary.
What was the name of the poem? Mars und Erde? What was it again?
What,
Mars. Oh, Mars. Okay, sorry. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Because I think this... Yes. But there were some other maybe poems you also were mentioning, but this potentiality at Aufge, giving up. Yes, and I think in what we're trying to write, we're trying to say, when you let go, it opens things up, right? And so when you're, what is rewilding? Rewilding is, okay, we're not going to try to control everything. We're not turning the whole world into a plantation and all this. And we will give space and trust and rely on the work and knowledge and motivation of millions of other creatures, right? And that will that will help us in various ways, but it's a way of letting go actually increases your potentiality, right? So exploring that, through poetry and Brecht and your work would be interesting for us, because I think we came to that without knowing that as well. And then I think for the second point, Chakrabarty, we have a bit of a complicated relationship. I think in some ways he's right about, he has his finger on a problem and he came to it fairly early, and one should give him credit for that. But of course, he's also very strange when it comes to saying that Marxism is not useful for this, and we have to, you can't blame capitalism. It's something, he becomes quite Malthusian in some of his work when he attacks, Andreas Malm and this kind of stuff. And I guess people wanting air conditioners in South Asia is also why we're in this mess, and developmental states are also why in this mess. So we can have a debate over that analysis. But I think the more important thing would be, and also I would disagree where I think some people would say, at this planetary level, you can intervene, obviously, right? And I think a lot of people want to intervene at that level through geoengineering, but also a lot of our Marxist friends want to nationalize the oil industry and engage in carbon capture at a mass scale, or get direct air capture and all this. And so there is that action at this planetary level. And I think the point is not to just give up in the face of the environmental catastrophe, but of finding out different ways of relating to the earth to try to prevent more harm from happening, and then and trying to realize that we do have to act as a planetary species of sorts, but knowing that that doesn't mean that we control the earth, and controlling the earth will destroy us and the earth. So what does it mean that we are this universal species, but also a very limited one at the same time, that recognizes our limits and tries to stabilize the earth by also relying on the earth's capabilities to stabilize itself, right? Rather than just being masters.
Maybe we should take another picture and say a little bit on this.
Hi. Two questions. One is that my feeling was hearing especially you talk about this idea of uselessness, which in principle I like very much, but my feeling was that in the whole debate of feminist political ecology that has been kind of already theorized under the term of care and caring for nature, and this whole idea of, the whole idea about reproductive work, not in terms of value producing, but precisely in terms of we care because we care. And there is no use value or exchange value being produced with it. So it's kind of wondering how you engage with this kind of thought line, which I think has kind of talked about this for quite some time. And my second thought was, I haven't read the book, so I don't quite know how you engage with the whole idea of half Earth. But I think just from a biodiversity conservation perspective, giving 50% back to wilderness, would be absolutely destructive to our ecosystems at the moment, because we have, human-managed ecosystems for many, many decades now. And I know you briefly mentioned your idea of community-based conservation and so on and so forth, but my feeling is just saying we'll give 50% away, won't get us anywhere in terms of biodiversity conservation. I think the feeling is how do we now manage and come to different management of nature?
Should we take one more maybe?
Da war noch da und hier.
Da sind noch zwei, ja?
Ich glaube, er war erst dahin, oder?
Dankeschön. Yeah, a question maybe. Sometimes I had the feeling that in the discourse, the way of talking about Daoism was a little off. Not off in the sense of wrong, but I think you mentioned it, how difficult it is, or not difficult, but this very special attention you can develop while bird watching, you mentioned it. And sometimes there was a binary divide. Still, you said it, there are things we cannot change, there's Daoism. And for everything else, we take a little bit of activism. And I think that's not the way to think about it. It has to be, one has to change, the other probably overcome it in ways I cannot say. The same as when we say there's a tree, a singular being that seems to be autonomous of something, but it's a network of things. We all know it, but it's so important to find words for it in poetry. And I think I would love to have another panel or workshop on Daoism, and maybe some Taiji scholars are in the room as well. So thank you. So.
Yeah, thanks for your thoughts. And got me thinking that maybe also one reason why ideas of action always seem to prevail in discourse in comparison to ideas of non-action is because in some way people want to feel like they're part of a movement of progress and want to follow some kind of tangible idea. And it almost seems like in political campaigning there's this need of formulating big actions and visions in order to get people excited and in order to have them follow you. So I'm curious if you could offer maybe some more thoughts on how to communicate non-action in a way to make it exciting and sexy, maybe, in order to have people feel like they belong to something that feels like progress, or feels like a vision.
All right. I'm going to attempt to synthesize an answer to all of these questions. Great. So let's see if I can pull it off. I would say that I think these care work and feminist ecology ideas are quite important to us. We didn't talk about it very much here, but to us, one of our, I think this is true for you too, Troy, but Carolyn Merchant is one of a great thinker that motivates us. This is a sort of a classic ecofeminist scholar, and she has this critique of the scientific revolution as something that takes the earth from a living thing to a dead thing. The earth goes from these older vitalist ideas and becomes this dead matter that can be exploited. And then, there's also this literature on care work. And I think one thing that's constant in all this literature is that while care work is a form of non-action, it's also a form of action and a form of work, hence the term work. And so in the same way that caring is hard work, it's a different kind of work, but it is still labor in some sense. It takes a lot of work to care for someone. In the same way, this is how we think about conservation to some degree. It's not you just abandon land and then expect things to fix themselves, but rather the literature of rewilding is actually it takes work to withdraw domination from something. So to make a ecosystem work well again, you have to do things like, if the landscape works with beavers, you introduce beavers, you rip out old materials, you add in the species that need to be there, and you work with the landscape. But it's a different kind of work than, say, growing a plantation of trees for bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, which is sort of the alternative to rewilding in the climate discourse. There is a grand land transition that is predicted by the IPCC, and that is turning about 20% of the Earth's surface into tree plantations for bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. Yeah, depending on your model. So, when you hear these news about, we have, this is our trajectory for climate change. The sustainable path, so SSP1, if you're insanely in the weeds of climate literature, they imagine that you basically turn like 20% of the earth into growing trees. You cut down the trees, you burn them for energy, you capture the carbon that's emitted when you burn, and you bury it underground. And this way you use the tree as a factory to absorb carbon from the air at scale and bury it underground. The alternative is, instead of using a living thing as your factory, you use an actual factory to absorb the carbon directly. This is these giant metal fans of direct air capture and burying it underground. And the appeal of these things is that they're permanent, that you take carbon and you bury it permanently underground in rocks rather than in living things. And while I have some sympathy with the idea that we want to take the stuff that we took out of the rocks back into the rocks, this is something that we need to do eventually. It's this fantasy of global control, and this idea that about a third of our historical emissions came from destroying the biosphere, and that they can be returned to the biosphere through this sort of the work of withdrawing domination is to us a very appealing thing that can be done now. It's a form of non-action that requires work, and I think this idea of this. Maybe the Daoist discussion not being quite right, and this idea that you were also talking about like how can we make non-action sexy in some sense. In some ways, I think that the only way you can do this is through being a part of a movement. So in my own life, I'm part of the climate movement. I'm also part of the labor movement in the US. And the thing that I've always seen is that when people join movements, if they're really a part of it, they change. So when I was in a labor union, I was the labor steward for the engineering school. And I found that as people went on strike, it was amazing to watch these engineers transform in just like about a year from the subjectivity in engineer to a subjectivity of a lot of solidarity. And people actually went, the thing that got the people the most mad in this quite engineering school was the basically the sexist treatment of some of the workers in the school, and I don't think that would have happened if it wasn't for the movement. I don't think people would have. That was the thing that actually made everyone go on strike. It was the sexist mistreatment of the women engineers, and that was sort of beautiful to watch. And I think. The demands weren't super sexy. It was very simple workplace protections and things like this, and yet it got people there because there were these relationships going on. So in the same way that there was not a grand total vision, it was a community that came together. This to me is this experience was transformative and helped. So I don't think I successfully gave a coherent answer to all the questions, but maybe there's something resonating across all of them. Yeah.
I would like to say something about your questions, at least, which is already quite a bit. One thing, this part of this talk, my part of this talk, and the thing I try to write about Brecht and Lao Tzu is, of course, not about my own way of thinking, but basically an attempt to reconstruct tensions between the sources, the philosophical sources that Brecht knew and was conflicted with, basically. The other thing is, though, when you ask me about my opinion after having read all this, I'm not sure of what I have to think about the whole half-Earth concept, but I would say that the Daoism that you referred to has, of course, to be something that informs everything. Either it informs everything that you try to conceive, or it's just useless or a byway or something that is, it doesn't do no good, it doesn't do any good. You can't avoid that kind of paradoxy ever when talking about this. And what I mean by, what I understand by Wu Wei, which I find quite attractive maybe and understandable at least, is the idea of Wu Wei not being just passive and doing just nothing, basically, as if you didn't exist, but a way of allowing interactions to take place where they want to take place. Sailing with the wind was the metaphor. Goethe, who was a true, old Goethe was a true Daoist. He says, der Bach ist dem Müller befreundet und sprudelt gern über die Räder. Was nützt es ihm, träge im Gras dahin zu schleichen? The creek prefers to actually drive the mill because it's something to do just by doing what it always does, streaming. It doesn't have to change course or anything. It is just doing something with something else, interacting with the mill. that is a nice way of putting it, I think. How not, of course, you use the force of the creek, but you don't force the creek to do anything that it didn't want to do by itself. And it's like the ecologists who say that the meadow improves, meaning the meadow has more species in it when you let cows graze in it than when you just leave it to itself and being a meadow, because it is sooner or later grown with wood. Let the cows graze. They like to eat the grass, and the grass is okay with being eaten by the cows and being transformed into whatever cows do with milk, with the grass transforming it into milk. You know, that's the difference between geoengineering and these two examples, with the cows in the meadow, the creek driving the mill. That's the difference between Stalin and Lao Tzu, basically. You know, that's the difference between geoengineering as a means of violence and the kind of non-violence, letting things go and manipulating them in your own interest. Because that's implied in the Wu Wei concept.
Should we take another round, or we have to? Well, maybe I'll say one thing just to disagree with Heinrich for a second. You know, I was in the Museum for Naturkunde yesterday, and there was a sign about different animals, and then in German I didn't realize there's a phrase for like Nutztiere, right? And I was just so horrified by that, and we don't have that phrase in English. And I suppose, like, you talk about cows. I would say, like, what does rewilding look like when we don't want, we don't see cows as like useful, Nutztiere to help us, chomp some grass, but like actually not want to dominate the, genome of a species, and to actually try to let that animal free from this like iron, grip we have. Like, what does it look like to have rewilding with like wild cattle, with like aurochs and all that? When there are attempts to do that, and they don't get along with us, as they're not as friendly as domesticated cows, right? And I would say, like, what does Germany look like with rewilding, right? I mean, Germany is an incredibly ecologically dead place, and the Netherlands is bad, and it's very bad, and there's also, one can do a huge amount to make this a wilder place, I would say. And I think this is also related to the Taoist point that when you want to have that experience of Wu Wei, you have to be in a place that is not controlled. You don't get that in a parking lot or in a mall or something like that. You get that where the landscape can surprise you, right? And you get that in an uncontrolled landscape. And there's a reason why people are drawn to, sublime is like a bad word, but this is the reason why people are drawn to these kind of wild places. And that's why they're important, even though they're, these are useless emotions, but they're incredibly important experiences. And for the last point about making these things sexy, if you look at the climate assemblies, once you talk to people about, mass extinction, climate, and all this kind of stuff, they say, like, okay, we'll eat less meat. Like, we'll have like some meat taxes. We'll, lower the speed on the highway. We'll try to accelerate the transition to renewables. Like, people want to do these things once you put it in the overarching context. And you talk to them about geoengineering. Like, no one wants geoengineering, Like, no one wants that kind of action. But we don't have the ability to really put these things all together and be like, is this the world you want? Do you want to choose this world, right? Do you want to live in that world? We have these like little separate debates. And that's, I think, the work of eco-socialists is to have that overarching debate, because people will choose. Most people are not vegan Marxists, but I think, like, when you put these things in context, a lot of it becomes a lot more appealing.
Maybe just a tiny little other note is I think this idea of climate assemblies are beautiful because it's trusting people that they will make good decisions. And I think this is something that people are afraid to do. I think there's a fear, even among socialists, of letting people do things. And I'll just say that, in my experience, people surprise you. Like, as a engineering union steward, I sometimes had little faith in the engineers that they would do good things. I will admit it. And every time and it leads you to get the subjectivity of the old union boss, which I, of course, didn't want to have this union boss subjectivity of like just telling people what they should do on the strike or everything, like this dominant view. So you had to prevent that. But there's a certain like, these people, they'll never go on strike. They're just all, on Twitter all day and whatever and eating Cheetos. But when we actually went on strike, I felt myself actually being pushed because I felt, we don't have the people power to do this because people aren't actually going to show up. Maybe we should compromise earlier. And then I was surprised when we went on strike. I was actually proven wrong because I had this idea of like, people don't come to our meetings, so they'll not rise to the occasion when the occasion comes. But I was wrong. I was totally wrong. And I think there's a certain amount of lack of faith in our current political moment because things look bad. And yet, even in an engineering school, people rose to the occasion in this it was almost magical. And that's sort of the faith of letting go that I have. But you ultimately don't know what people will do if you give them all the power. I really do think that they do the right thing.
Yeah, I think it's a very good last word. Thank you very much. Heinrich Detering, Pendergrass, Vettese.